after.
Good afternoon. I'm Rebeccah Heinrichs, a fellow here at Hudson Institute, where I have the privilege of research and writing on a variety of national security subjects, but I focus on missile defense and nuclear deterrence policy. Thank you all for joining us today to discuss a newly released study by the National Institute for Public Policy entitled A New Nuclear Review for a New Age. I'll let Keith tell you more about the study in just a moment, but first, allow me to provide very brief introductions of our panelists. Dr. Keith Payne is professor and head of the Graduate Department of Defense and Strategic Studies at Missouri State University. He is also president and co-founder of the National Institute for Public Policy and the director of the study we are discussing today. Keith served in the Department of Defense as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Forces Policy. Dr. Thomas Karako, we'll go to Matt here. Dr. Matthew Kroenig is an associate professor in the Department of Government and the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and a senior fellow in the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council. And then Dr. Thomas Karako is a senior fellow with the International Security Program and the director of the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, where he arrived in 2014 as a fellow with the Project on Nuclear Issues. His research focuses on national security, U.S. nuclear forces, missile defense, and public law. With that, what I intend to do is turn the discussion over to Keith for him to outline some of the highlights in the report, and then we'll move our way down, and then I will add my own comments on the missile defense portion, and then we'll have a short discussion with me moderating, and then we'll turn over the last 10 or 15 minutes of our time together with questions from the audience. So please do prepare those as you listen to the discussion. And with that, Keith.
Okay. Thank you, Rebeccah, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here at the Hudson Institute in this beautiful new building. And I should add that almost 40 years ago, I worked at Hudson Institute. I was Herman Kahn's assistant for almost 4 years, and Herman Kahn was the original director of the Hudson Institute. And it was a great postgraduate education for me. I was working for Herman Kahn at the Hudson Institute for 4 years. He was a genius, and a genius particularly on the subjects that we're going to be talking about here very briefly. What I'll do is discuss very briefly the origins of this study, because in some ways the origins of the study are help define the conclusions presented in the study. It began about 19 months ago. The efforts to put this together began about 19 months ago, which was well before we knew who was going to win this election. In fact, it was before we knew who all was going to be running for the presidency. And so what we wanted to do was put together a study that would help inform the 2017 NPR. Now, at the time, we didn't know that there was going to be a 2017 NPR. We just knew that there had been 3 previous NPRs, and administrations tend to put in process a nuclear posture review, NPR, when they come in. And so in anticipation that the new administration, whoever might win the election, would have a nuclear posture review, what we wanted to do was put together a study that could be useful for those people who then actually have the responsibility of writing a nuclear posture review. And so as soon as President Trump came into office, very shortly thereafter, he in fact mandated that there would be a nuclear posture review in 2017. And the original public discussion of it said it would be done in 6 months. And if you trail that back, it would be due sometime in October. Whether that holds or not, we'll see. But our effort was to put together a bipartisan group. Again, we didn't know who was going to win this election, so we wanted a bipartisan group with very credible participants, both as writers and as senior reviewers. And that's exactly what we did. I think there's copies available out in the entrance area there, and what you'll see on the front page are the participants in this, and what you'll notice is that the senior review group included a very diverse set of folks. Retired senior military, in fact, 4 former commanders of the Strategic Command or the Strategic Air Command participated. 2 senators, Senator Kyle and Senator Robb, participated. We had technical expertise and policy expertise, including folks who had worked on all of the previous NPRs. And so we had a wide array of folks working on this, and we also wanted to include some folks from the younger generation who are undoubtedly going to be writing whenever the next NPR comes around the corner. They'll undoubtedly be working on that. So that was our goal, is to have a bipartisan group, a multidisciplinary group. And I should add that the gentleman who ran the senior review group, the person who chaired the senior group, was a gentleman named Johnny Foster. Dr. Johnny Foster, who some of you will recognize the name of. Johnny Foster is a legend. He goes back to the Kennedy administration, a true expert in all of these matters, but indeed a technical sort of wizard in these subjects. And so it was a real pleasure to have someone of Dr. Foster's credibility to be the chair of the senior review group. So that's sort of the setup for the study. I should say that the timing turned out to be impeccable. I wish I could claim that we actually planned the timing to work out the way it did, but the study became available basically at the beginning of the official process for the writing of the Nuclear Posture Review. Sometimes luck is better than anything else. So the study was printed, virtually overlapped with the beginning of the official Nuclear Posture Review. And let me just add, for those of you who haven't followed this subject in detail, the Nuclear Posture Review that's underway right now is the fourth in the series of Nuclear Posture Reviews, the first one going back to 1994 in the Clinton administration. Let me take just a minute to identify a couple of the main points and then turn this over to my colleagues here to continue the discussion. Our thesis coming in really was comparable to the original starting points of every previous NPR. Every previous NPR has said that when the security environment changes dramatically, then the United States needs to reconsider its nuclear policies and its nuclear posture, because the strategic environment, and by that's meant the threat environment, the international political environment, if there are changes, then those changes may well have implications for how the United States thinks about nuclear policy and its nuclear force structure. And so what we looked at was the political environment, the strategic environment, if you will. How had it changed since the most recent Nuclear Posture Review? And the most recent Nuclear Posture Review had been done in 2010 by the Obama administration. And so if you just think back to 2010, and actually 2009 when it was being written, and where we are today, it's pretty obvious that there's been dramatic changes since then. And so what we did in the first part of the monograph, of the text, is just do a fairly straightforward discussion of what's new and what's different since 2010. And I won't take any time to go through that here, but if you look, for example, at the expectations of our relationship with Russia, just changed dramatically. If you go back and think about the immediate post-Cold War period, the general notion was that Russia was essentially going to be a partner, maybe a quasi-ally, probably not a formal ally, but a quasi-ally. In other words, there was going to be great cooperation with Russia. And so the bad Cold War was over. We had entered a new environment. People called it a new world order, if you can remember. History was over. We sort of solved all those problems. Nuclear weapons were no longer very relevant, and they were of declining relevance. Nuclear deterrence was of declining relevance and declining usefulness. That was the notion of what the post-Cold War world was going to be like. And in fact, if you look at what the United States did, it took that view of the international security environment very much to heart. And so if you just go back and look at the number of nuclear weapons, the types of nuclear systems that the United States has deployed and what it's done with those, since the end of the Cold War, what you see is a steep slope of elimination of forces, reduction of forces. In fact, depending on exactly what you count, probably have eliminated approximately 85% of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, deployed nuclear arsenal, has been eliminated since those days. So where does that put us now? What that suggested us as we were putting this report together was that the environment has now changed dramatically. Russia now emphasizes nuclear weapons. It emphasizes the potential use of nuclear weapons. It engages in explicit nuclear threats. Sort of every Tuesday and Thursday, someone else gets threatened by Russia with nuclear attack. They threaten NATO allies. They threaten the United States. They threaten neutrals, One of the more recent ones was a nuclear threat to Sweden. And so what you see, in addition to this kind of change in tone, change in discussion, is a very serious nuclear modernization program that goes back more than a decade. So to make a long story short, what you see again is a major change in the threat environment faced by the United States. The threat environment in Asia, I won't go into detail about that. Everybody's been reading about what North Korea is doing, Chinese expansionism into the East China Sea, for example. The environment's changed, so the United States needs to reconsider its general post-Cold War positions with regard to nuclear policy and nuclear posture. And so that's what this study does. Given where we are in the world, the direction, the uncertainties involved, how should we now think about nuclear forces and nuclear policy? And that's the setup for where the rest of the study goes. And with that, I'm happy to turn this over to my colleagues.
Great, thank you. Matt?
Great. Well, first, thank you very much to Rebeccah and to Hudson for hosting this event. Thanks to Keith for inviting me, for being to be part of the study. And thanks to you all for coming out today. Dr. Payne asked me to be part of the study to look specifically at the relationship between U.S. nuclear weapons and nuclear non-proliferation. And he asked me to do this because I've been doing some writing in this area. I have an article that came out in the Journal of Peace Research, a peer-reviewed political science journal last year, looking at this issue. Just one more plug, I have a book coming out next year with Oxford University Press called The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy. And there's a chapter in that book that also looks at the relationship between U.S. nuclear weapons and non-proliferation. And this is an important relationship because for many years, many U.S. officials argued that the United States needs to reduce the size of its nuclear arsenal and de-emphasize nuclear weapons in order to help combat the spread of nuclear proliferation elsewhere. And so they argued that if the United States, the largest superpower on Earth, needs a large nuclear arsenal to protect itself, then what kind of message does that send to Iran, to North Korea, to other non-nuclear states? It's going to make it more likely, they asserted, that those countries would want nuclear weapons. And they argued that even if it doesn't affect Iran directly, it affects U.S. non-proliferation policy more broadly. If we're trying to build international coalitions to put pressure on Iran or North Korea, it's difficult to go to, say, Turkey or Brazil or other non-nuclear states and say, we need your help to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. Difficult to make that case, they asserted, when we have thousands of nuclear weapons. So therefore, they argued we should reduce the size of our nuclear arsenal, and that'll help dissuade other countries from pursuing nuclear weapons and also make it easier for us to get international cooperation on non-proliferation issues. So at a superficial level, this makes sense, but when you start to investigate it a little bit more, as I point out, the argument really falls apart. So I'm a political scientist by training. I'm a professor at Georgetown. There's a large academic literature, peer-reviewed academic literature on why countries pursue nuclear weapons or give them up, a large academic literature on why countries adopt certain nuclear non-proliferation policies, kind of a wide range of variables that we think drive these policies. But in the peer-reviewed literature, contrary to what's often asserted in Washington, there are no studies that show that the size of the U.S. nuclear arsenal or whether the U.S. is emphasizing nuclear weapons somehow influences other countries. And, if you start to think about it, it makes sense. Imagine you're Iran's supreme leader. You're trying to decide whether to advance your nuclear program or put limits on it, build nuclear weapons or not. There are a lot of things that you're probably thinking about. You're thinking, would having nuclear weapons improve my security? Can I build nuclear weapons? Do we have the technical capability? If we don't have the technical capability, can we get help? And what about the international pressure? How much international pressure are we going to run up against? Are there going to be difficult sanctions, maybe military strikes from Israel or United States or others? So when you're thinking through those issues, it's just kind of implausible to think that the supreme leader is saying, well, let's see, does the United States have 1,550 nuclear weapons or 1,000? And if they have 1,550, then we'll push ahead. But if they have 1,000, then we'll stop. It's just really not plausible that that's one of the most important considerations. Or similarly, think about a country whose cooperation we're trying to get on nuclear non-proliferation issues. Imagine Turkey. Turkey was a country who we thought was important in the Iran nuclear negotiations because it's a border, shares a border with Iran. There was a lot of trade between Turkey and Iran. So imagine you're Turkey. President Erdogan trying to decide whether to participate in sanctions against Iran on non-proliferation, you're probably thinking, well, do I care if Iran has nuclear weapons? What is the cost to my economy to put difficult economic sanctions on Iran? What is the cost to the kind of bilateral relationship between my country and Iran for these sanctions? What is my relationship with the United States if I don't participate on these non-proliferation issues? But again, kind of implausible to think that President Erdogan was thinking, well, let's see, does the United States have 1,500 or 1,000 nuclear weapons? If they have 1,500, I won't participate, but if they have 1,000, I will. So logically and theoretically, it doesn't really make much sense to think that there's a leak, or a link, excuse me. A lot of leaking in Washington, so slip of the tongue. So in this study for the Journal of Peace Research, I go beyond that and then do some systematic empirical tests and look for relationships between the size of the U.S. nuclear arsenal and kind of tangible non-proliferation outcomes. Are countries acquiring, pursuing, exploring nuclear weapons? Are they transferring sensitive nuclear technology to others? How are they voting on nuclear non-proliferation issues in the UN Security Council and elsewhere? And I was unable to find any kind of correlations. Was able to find correlations between these factors that we've known have mattered for a long time, security and other things, but no correlation between U.S. nuclear policy and these countries' nuclear non-proliferation policies. And then I did a case study as well and looked at the Iran nuclear crisis and how that developed. The advance of Iran's nuclear program, the getting international cooperation to put pressure on Iran, the negotiations. There were a lot of factors driving the program, driving the international effort against it, Iran's behavior, its security environment, but no evidence that U.S. nuclear reduction somehow helped us to get cooperation on Iran. And in fact, I interviewed Obama's director for Iran policy at the White House, and he said as much, that he didn't think that our nuclear reductions had an effect directly on Iran or the Iran nuclear negotiations. So if that's the case, then, if it is the case that there's not a link, then, what are the implications? Well, one implication is we should set our nuclear arsenal for other priorities, not for non-proliferation, for deterrence, assurance, damage limitation, other things, objectives that we think are important for U.S. nuclear weapons. And when it comes to non-proliferation, then non-proliferation is important. We should work to stop other countries from building nuclear weapons. But there we should rely on other more proven tools, the nuclear non-proliferation regime, sanctions, other tools. There's no reason to believe really that reductions in our arsenal is somehow going to make it easier to stop proliferation elsewhere. And there's just one exception where there does seem to be a link, which is with our allies. There are countries like Japan, South Korea, countries in NATO, especially in Eastern Europe, that really depend a lot on the U.S. nuclear umbrella. And they've decided to forego their own nuclear capability because they believe they can rely on the U.S. nuclear extended deterrent. So they do pay close attention to U.S. nuclear policy, posture, changes to posture. And we haven't seen an effect here yet because we've done a pretty good job of extending deterrence and reassuring these countries. But if you go talk to them, as me and my colleagues do, they'll express concerns about the United States cutting too low, about reducing reliance on nuclear weapons too much. And so there could be an effect. If South Korea, Japan, Poland believe that they can no longer rely on the U.S. nuclear deterrent, then I think there is a danger that they may consider their own independent arsenals. So I think I'll end my remarks there and turn it over to the next speaker.
Well, thanks to Hudson for hosting, and it's a great building, and thanks to Keith for allowing me to participate in this. I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to kind of hit some of the very high points of the principles that I think really inform the study and that really make it is going to make it durable. Second, talk a bit about how missile defense really contributes to deterrence, assurance, and damage limitation goals. And then third, go a bit beyond it and talk a bit about kind of competing issues of flexibility and adaptability being kind of the touchstone of all this, and then especially how it relates to conventional forces as well. And I think just to begin, I don't think Keith mentioned this, that really, if there's one takeaway, it is that this study really puts deterrence back atop the U.S. nuclear agenda in a big and really explicit way. taken off of the top of the nuclear agenda, very clearly, very deliberately in the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, and this kind of puts it back. And that's, as Keith was saying, really a function of the times as much as anything. The actions of Russia, I think, and others would prompt anybody kind of doing this study in this time to do something like that. And there's a couple of programs underway that, in terms of the flexibility and resilience, the principles that the study emphasizes, that I think are so incredibly important in a time of so much change, of so much turmoil. It's hard to predict what's going to be 5 years from now. And so therefore that flexibility and resilience becomes so important. And two of the things I think really to single out here are the GBSD program and the LRSO program. The kind of future ICBM force and the future air-launched cruise missile, the distributed quality of the first, and the flexible and penetrating quality of the second kind of deal with doubts about survivability, right? That might be tempting to some actor to attack the United States, and then also, I think the LRSO, notwithstanding I would say the sanguine character of the debate out there in the prints about kind of the ease with which we have stealth, we have penetration capabilities, that's going to be hard to keep up, to sustain that capability in the face of a very aging outcome. And likewise, the B-21 is not going to be a Klingon bird of prey with a cloaking device. I think we kind of think about those things as just all too easy, but sustaining that, I think, is going to make LRSO very important to maintain. So let me move now to U.S. and allied missile defense capabilities. These missile defense and conventional forces were prominent in the last two NPRs. The 2010 NPR had missile defense, some 20 times in the pace of a 65-page document. And explicitly was talked about in the last administration how missile defense strengthens regional deterrence. And I think that desire for integration between, you might say, active defense and nuclear policy is going to, the appetite for that has only grown. In the face, I would say, of a very diverse air and missile threat that's changing. It's not strictly about ballistic missiles anymore. Lots of cruise missile threats, lots of air threats that are really complicating the calculus. What if it were the case that our ICBM force might be attacked not with nuclear weapons, but with some other force, some other capabilities in that spectrum? How do we think about that? I think there's a couple ways in which missile defenses support deterrence specifically. First of all, is to create options and to support freedom of action rather than kind of creating pressure for retaliation or preemption. And so, for instance, in 2006, the Bush administration, having a little bit of homeland missile defense deployed, had a choice to not strike a typo dong on the launch pad, as then Bill Perry and Ash Carter suggested that we do. In 2016, fall of 2016, a U.S. ship, the Mason, was attacked off the coast of Yemen by some anti-ship cruise missiles, right? You might not have heard all that much about it. It might be forgettable because that ship wasn't sunk in the way that an Emirati ship was sunk just the week before. And so the United States had the option to respond in a manner of its choosing rather than being sucked into a ground war in Yemen in that sense. Scud hunting is hard, after all. And the July 4 launch of the ICBM, we might have had some indications that it was coming, but not, I think it's fair to say, in a kind of an actionable way to go out and strike it preemptively. So therefore, as these threats get more mobile, get more survivable, get harder to hit left of launch as the hiding gets easier than the finding, this is going to remain important. Also, raising the threshold for attack. And, I think that all the talk about an adversary wanting to escalate to de-escalate is applicable here. And I think there might be some value to thinking about how low-tier air and missile defenses against so-called non-strategic missile threats, say Russian missiles, might contribute to stability by kind of taking some of the easy smash and grab type scenarios off the table, making that a little bit harder, raising the threshold, say in Europe. And a third way in which I think this contributes to deterrence is through supporting operations, right? By supporting the technical ability to execute a deterrent threat. Defenses for various points, like points of debarkation, as well as the freedom of maneuver, can therefore improve the credibility of our forward deployed forces. The U.S. Army is talking a lot about kind of multi-domain battle stuff, right? That's the catchword of the day, right? They like to talk about maneuver, but there's going to need to be enough air and missile defenses to protect that maneuver so that the credibility of any response on land or across domains can be brought to bear. And then also kind of assurance, right? The attempt by North Korea or some other power to try to decouple the alliance relationships between the United States and our allies by, say, threatening or trying to blackmail the U.S. homeland or U.S. forces is in a sense kind of obvious. And having even some kind of thin defense against those things, it makes that harder and strengthens assurance. But of course, also damage limitation. As President Clinton said in 2000, homeland missile defense in the event of deterrence failure is an extra dimension of insurance. And I really want to talk now, kind of move on to the next thing, and that's a little bit about competing metrics of flexibility. And the principles of flexibility and resilience that apply so well to the nuclear force, I think, are also should be applied to any missile defense decisions. The nuclear posture review and the missile defense review going on, of course, simultaneously. And three additional principles of adaptability that this report highlights are kind of diversity and readiness of the force, the ability to make changes in the force, and the potential to modify existing capabilities through hardware changes. Right, so wherever it is that we put our missile defenses, wherever we put our interceptors, they're going to need to be, I would say, adapted and evolved over time. One man's flexibility, it might be another man's rigidity. And so therefore, what might seem to be contributors to flexibility from mobile or sea-based interceptors might actually tie up those assets in different ways and might actually spread us thin in others. And a final kind of point is that, to repeat myself, it's not just about ballistics anymore. And notwithstanding the fact that the presidentially mandated review is the BMDR, right, there is a spectrum of threats. As the former Vice Chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Sandy Winnefeld, said a couple years ago, homeland cruise missile defense is in some ways more important in his mind than regional ballistic missile defense. Right? And what he's talking about there, I think, is a near peer with cruise missiles. They can hold at risk various things here at home. And so I think the importance of integrated air and missile defense and conventional forces to support all this are just as important as well. And I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you, Tom. And then I will provide just additional remarks on the missile defense piece before we turn it over to discussion. As Tom said, we have seen an increase in the number of ballistic, not just ballistic missile, but in other types of missile threats as well. And this is because countries see ballistic and cruise missiles as a cost-effective way to hold at risk other countries, militaries that are much more advanced than their own, including the United States. It enables them to coerce and blackmail the United States in a very cost-effective way. And missiles are also viewed as symbols of national power and prestige. There's a recently released Pentagon report that does a nice job of kind of laying out the different sorts of missile threats that we see today. But just as hostile nations have made great technical progress in their missile systems, so has the United States made great progress in our missile defense systems. And just to highlight a few notable successful tests that the program has had. And again, many of you in the audience do know this, but when we talk about our missile defense systems, we're not talking about just one particular system. We really have a system of systems. So it's a variety of different types of missile defense systems that complement one another and intercept different kinds of missiles in different phases of the incoming missile's flight path. The Aegis weapon system in February of this year successfully intercepted an MRBM with the SM-32A missile. And then in May of this year, just days after North Korea tested yet another missile in a very important test called the FTG-15, the Ground-Based Mid-Course Defense System, or the GMD system. That is the only missile defense system the United States currently has deployed to protect the United States homeland from an incoming ICBM. And it successfully intercepted its first ICBM-class target. And this successful test, the FTG-15, also earned an upgrade in the what I have always considered a tough audience over at the Office of Test and Evaluation, upgraded its status, giving it an increased stamp of approval for the reliability of the system. And just a couple of days ago, the THAAD system intercepted a test target. So those were three great, and that was the 14th out of 14 successful intercepts for the THAAD system. With these, I'm also happy to report that combined with the technical successes of these programs, the new administration is much more friendly, at least in open statements from the president himself, from the Secretary of Defense, et cetera, of much more friendly towards the idea of expanding missile defense for the United States. And with a Congress eager to build on these technical successes and close the vulnerabilities that do exist, there is some increased momentum to expand and invest in missile defense across the board, to be sure, but especially systems meant to protect the U.S. homeland, as Tom just mentioned in the last portion of his remarks, that there does seem to be an increased threat to the U.S. homeland, not just from the threats that we've seen from the kinds of threats that North Korea and Iran can pose, but also a worry now from near-peer competitors as well. And so if I could just offer a few highlights as to what the United States can do to increase and expand the reliability of homeland missile defense, and these are also mentioned in the report as well. Again, GMD, that's the Homeland Missile Defense portion. There is room in Fort Greely, Alaska, to expand out the number of ground-based interceptors there. We've already completed the environmental impact studies. That's done, ready to go. We just have to finish those fields there and buy the ground-based interceptors to put in those fields. That just gives the United States more bullets to have ready to go. We could, to me, that would be a sort of no-brainer to move that program along. We could also move forward with portable ground-based interceptors on the east coast of the United States. We really could, you could put them anywhere to close those the thinner layers of coverage that the United States has to protect the U.S. homeland. And just on this point, too, because there has been some misinformation in the media about what the ground-based mid-course defense system provides protection for. It does provide protection for the entire United States. That includes Hawaii as well. And the United States should move forward with filling out, increasing the space sensor layer that the United States currently has. This will provide overall increased reliability of the entire system. It provides birth to death tracking, so we can follow the incoming missile from birth to death, which would increase the overall reliability of the entire system. And then last, I would say that the United States should also move forward with an interceptor layer in space. The House of Representatives recently just marked up the defense bill in the HASC committee and passed. Congressman Trent Franks, my former boss, introduced an amendment that passed out of committee. And what it would do is it would move forward with a test bed for a space-based layer, and it's something that we certainly recommend in the report as well. We've studied this subject enough. A lot of times, the opponents of moving forward to a space-based interceptor layer will say we need to study the concept more. But there are numerous studies now that show that it would give the United States a significant qualitative improvement of the whole system to be able to have interceptor layer in space as well. So we should move forward with that, and there is also support in the Senate Last year, the Congress, in a bipartisan way, moved to amend the National Missile Defense Act so that it no longer states that the United States would develop a system to defend against limited threats, a limited missile defense system. We could always build a missile defense system to defend against whatever threats the United States perceived against its own interests. But the way the law was written, many people interpreted it as that the United States could only build a limited defense against ballistic missiles. So now that that limited is struck, I think it clarifies very nicely that the United States is free to build and to expand and develop any missile defense system that only limited by technological limits. And so that is a great policy development that we've seen. So that portends great things, I think, for missile defense expansion and improvement in the years to come. I'll close with that, if I may, and then I will turn to Keith with my first question for you. And that is the subject of treaties and Russia. Russia was found in violation of the INF Treaty during the previous administration. It continues to be in violation of that treaty. And there is some discussion about what the United States should do about that. Can you talk a little bit about that and what your recommendations might be?
Sure. In fact, the Obama administration found the Russian Federation in violation of the INF Treaty, which is one of the centerpieces of nuclear arms control. As publicly reported, the administration brought this concern to the Russians, and the Russian response was show us the proof that we're violating this, and then turning around and charging the United States with violating the INF Treaty. And there, as far as is available on the open press, there hasn't been much progress with regard to getting the Russians to move back from the areas in which they're violating the treaty. And so the question really presents itself is, what does the United States do when it has an arms control partner, historically, that tends to violate treaties? Because the INF Treaty isn't the only treaty that the Russian Federation or agreement the Russian Federation has not abided by. It goes back to a whole series of treaties and agreements that the Russian Federation has decided it either doesn't want to abide by, or it appears that it's not abiding by. And so the basic question is, what do you do with regard to an arms control agenda when your main negotiating partner cannot be counted upon to comply with an agreement, even if you can verify the agreement? Or the usual answer is, well, we'll make sure that we can verify the agreement. And that's great. We should be able to verify agreements. But what do you do when you have an agreement that you believe is suitably verified, but your negotiating partner simply doesn't abide by it? Because then the question becomes enforcement. How do you enforce a treaty when you have a sovereign state deciding that it's going to violate its terms? Because frankly, that's where we are. We have a whole series of agreements with Russia going back to the presidential nuclear initiatives, which were a political commitment by Yeltsin that the Russian Federation is simply not abiding by. This has to do with tactical nuclear weapons. The INF Treaty that Rebeccah mentioned. There's even some consideration that the Russian Federation is in violation of the Open Skies Agreement, which is an agreement that goes back for decades. And so what we suggested is that the United States needs to reconsider how we think about our arms control agenda. And not because we shouldn't be open to arms control agreements that serve the national interest. We should be open to arms control agreements that serve the national interest. The question is, can you achieve an arms control agreement that you believe is reliably able to serve the national interest when we have now decades of experience that the partner with whom we're negotiating does not abide reliably by those agreements? And so really the question is, do you set up a standard that your partner has to be a partner in these agreements in good standing before you'll continue this process? My personal view is, yes, that should be a requirement, that we need to have a partner that's in good standing before we continue this process. We should be open to the process, but realize that our main negotiating partner here has not proven itself to be a worthy arms control interlocutor. Just has not, and I don't say that with joy. I say that as a reality. And so where does that lead you? What's the bottom line of that? The bottom line of that is that the Russian Federation needs to come back into compliance with agreements it has already signed, or withdraw per the terms of the agreement. You say, well, isn't it doing that? No. The INF agreement, it just basically has stalemated on that. Other agreements, for example, the CFE treaty, which dealt with the forces in Central Europe. The Russian Federation hasn't withdrawn from it, it just said it's no longer going to abide by it. And so the conclusion that we reach, and then my own personal conclusion, is we need to have a partner that we can trust, in the sense of, if they sign an agreement and there's verification of that agreement, we don't have to try and figure out how do we enforce the agreement when we know that that partner is a habitual violator of agreements. And so if you put that up as a standard, it changes the orientation. It changes the way you might approach what you can and can't do with arms control in a reasonable way.
Thank you. Matt, you did a great job, I think, of sort of dispelling the myth that U.S. reductions actually, have a stabilizing effect. But what do we do? Keith had mentioned that the Russians seem to be threatening somebody with nuclear weapons every Tuesday or Thursday, and it's Thursday, so they're threatening somebody. What should the United States do then to extend assurance to our allies in practical ways in the near term, and to deter Russia that doesn't escalate an already tense situation, especially in Eastern Europe? What are some specific things that the United States could do in the near term?
It's a great question, and I think the first thing we need to do is have a clear kind of nuclear deterrence strategy for Russia, because the nuclear threat that Russia poses now is very different from the nuclear threat it posed during the Cold War. So as many of you might know, Russia has this idea of de-escalatory nuclear strikes. So basically the idea is that if they get into a major war with NATO, rather than lose the war, they would begin conducting small numbers of nuclear strikes on NATO forces on the ground, maybe critical infrastructure or other things in Eastern Europe, with the goal being to frighten U.S. and Western leaders into backing down and suing for peace on terms favorable to Moscow. So that's a really difficult problem. Put yourself in the shoes of the U.S. president. How would you respond to that? Say Russia invades NATO, invades a U.S. ally. We go to war to defend the ally, and Russia uses a nuclear weapon, say against U.S. forces on the ground or NATO ships at sea. How would you respond? Well, I talked to many former U.S. government officials, and some of them will say, well, let's just back down. I'm not willing to fight a nuclear war over Estonia. Okay, but if that's your policy, then you tell Russia, all you need to do is use a nuclear weapon or two and you can take whatever you want. So that's not a very good strategy. Others say, well, let's just fight through it conventionally. Let's maintain the moral high ground. Even if they're going to use nuclear weapons, we're not going to do that. Okay, so maybe that works for the first one. But what about when they use the second, the third, the fourth? These aren't just symbolic weapons. They could have a devastating effect on the battlefield, would make it very difficult for us to win a war if they're using tactical nuclear weapons and we're only willing to fight conventionally. Others say, well, our policy should be massive nuclear retaliation. That's kind of always been our policy. If they hit us with a nuke, we're going to hit them back with everything we've got. Okay, but the continental United States is still intact. Western Europe's still intact. Do you really want to open us up to potential retaliation from hundreds of Russian nuclear warheads? So I think the best answer should be that we have our own kind of limited nuclear war strategy. That if they think they can use a small number of nuclear weapons in Eastern Europe, we can retaliate. And of course, the purpose isn't because we want to fight a limited nuclear war, but it's to deter Russia from going down that path in the first place. But this isn't official U.S. policy right now. That's just my view. So I think that's the first problem. We need to have a strategy. And if we don't have our own strategy about how we'll respond to this, then there's good reason for President Putin to think he can get away with it. And then second, if you decide you want to go down this limited nuclear war strategy path as a deterrent, then you get into a scenario and say, okay, well, which nuclear weapon would you use? And that's a problem too. We don't really have many tailored, flexible kind of nuclear options that can penetrate Russian air defenses in Eastern Europe. So I think that's something else the nuclear posture review should look at. What are some other kind of more flexible, lower yield nuclear options that we could deploy in NATO or bring, at least have deployable to Europe in the event of one of these conflicts that would serve as a credible deterrent?
Great, thank you. Sticking on the same theme a little bit here, Tom, and coming to you on missile defense, there has been, and we'll start with Russia. We'll do the harder question first. Russia objects to the U.S. plans to finish out the EPAA in Eastern Europe. But this administration intends to move forward with those deployments anyway, and Russia continues to object. So can you talk a little bit about what the plans are there, and then also make a recommendation as to what the United States should do about these Russian protests there, especially in Poland and other options there? And then the second part of the question, if I could, then switching regions of the world, the THAAD system in South Korea. It relates to the first question because China also objects to the deployment of THAAD in South Korea. So can you address those 2 points for us?
So when he was the TRADOC commander, a gentleman by the name of H.R. McMaster published something this spring which described missile defense as a foundational capability for everything that we do in national security. And I think that especially when you understand that in terms of the low-tier air and missile defense, it's very compelling. Now, I think that both you and actually Matt have pointed in this direction, and that is the low tier. Notwithstanding the fact that I think we're going to do a lot more stuff for homeland missile defense. I think whoever would be the president would be doing more stuff for homeland relative to where we were. But I think that doing more on the low-tier air missile defense is critical, not just for North Korea. And what do I mean by that? Well, in particular, Matt brought up the escalation problem. If you're going to get into that kind of a problem, it's going to start with something. It's probably going to start with something smaller. And I think that there's probably a lot more room for low-tier air and missile defense to, again, raise the threshold for aggression. Take some of the cheap shots off the table, not merely for North Korea, but also take some of the cheap shots off the table by Russia. And so therefore, when you think about, the smash and grab type fait accomplis that we worry about for Eastern Europe and that kind of thing, is it conceivable that some low-tier air and missile defense could complicate their calculus enough to, kind of prevent that escalation, kind of take those temptations away in the first place? Now, you mentioned the Russian and Chinese objections to these things. Yes, there is no matter how slow, no matter how small in number the Patriot deployment is, there's no missile defense or air defense system that China and Russia don't hate. And I think in the first instance, that's because of the political connections. But in the second instance, because if you're going to take off the no-kidding opportunities and temptations for them to push their neighbors around and cajole them, they don't want to do that. And so therefore, I want to highlight something that the House of Representatives, the House Armed Services Committee, put into their bill language for the NDAA, and that's to say to the U.S. Army, okay, guys, it's been a long time in this whole modernization thing. If you don't get this right, and you don't get us a 360-degree protection for your air and missile for your Patriot stuff, we're going to take it away from you, and we're going to give it to the Missile Defense Agency. Now, the Army kind of began looking at this and set a requirement back when cruise missiles were still young in 1993. That was a quarter century ago, right? We still do not have 360-degree protection for our Patriot forces, and if you're kind of trying to have a protection of your Army maneuvering forces for the European Reassurance Initiative in Eastern Europe, you're going to want something that is actually tailored to the threats of the 21st century, not those of the 1980s or 1990s. And so there's a problem there that needs to be prioritized, I think, in a big way to deter and to take those temptations off the table. The THAAD thing as well, test records going well. The intercept this week was actually the first IRBM I'm waiting for folks to say that it was barely an IRBM, but they seems to be doing well. I think the thing to comment upon there is the political situation in South Korea. There's a little bit of noise and rumbling about whether they should get a few more launchers out there than just a couple. I think the real question is, why aren't there more right now? The purpose of THAAD, the purpose of Patriots in South Korea is not to sit there and play catch, but to provide a defensive support to the overall deterrence and defense posture for U.S. forces, so that, no kidding, you cannot decapitate and retard our response if you decide to do something nasty today.
Thank you. With that, I will, if we could take maybe, we've got time for 2 questions, if we can keep them brief. If you could just raise your hand to indicate you have one, and the microphone will come to you. Please do introduce yourself, and then keep your question to a question, and very brief, please.
Hi, my name is Mateo. I was curious, given the abject failure of the Iranian nuclear deal, what lessons can we learn when we negotiate with countries in the future attempting to stop proliferation, say, when Turkey or Saudi Arabia seek to have the same technology?
Matt?
Well, I think I was a critic of the Iran nuclear deal. I understand the arguments in favor, but it's really been a principle of U.S. non-proliferation policy going back decades to really draw a firm line between peaceful nuclear programs, operating nuclear reactors for the production of energy or for research, drawing a firm line between that and making the fuel for nuclear reactors. Because once you can make the fuel for nuclear reactors, you can make the fuel for nuclear weapons. So U.S. non-proliferation policy essentially has always been to draw that line, allow and even encourage countries to have nuclear reactors, but prohibit them from having the fuel-making capability, uranium enrichment, plutonium reprocessing. So this is something we've imposed even on our closest allies. Taiwan, South Korea in the 1970s were trying to have this fuel-making capability. We forced them to shut it down. One Taiwanese scientist said, by the time the Americans got through with us, I'm surprised we're allowed to teach physics here in Taiwan. The vast majority of countries on Earth with truly peaceful nuclear programs don't make their own fuel. They get the fuel shipped in by Russia or France or another country, operate the fuel, run the fuel through the reactor and send it back. And in the Iran deal, that was our goal in the negotiations, that was our goal for a decade, get Iran to shut down the enrichment program. If they really want a peaceful program, we'll let them have it. But then we caved, and we allowed Iran to have this enrichment program. So I think that makes it harder for us to stop Iran once the limits on this deal expire. And it also sets a dangerous precedent. So already South Korea, United Arab Emirates, others are saying, well, if you trust Iran with this fuel-making capability, a state that's basically a U.S. enemy that's cheated on its past non-proliferation agreements, then why don't you trust us? In the case of South Korea, democracy, a close ally. So I think it's made it harder going forward, but for me the lesson is we need to stick to our principles that have worked and drawing this firm line against the spread of enrichment and reprocessing technologies. It's one thing if a country tries to go down this path, it's a completely different one, as we did in the Iran nuclear deal, to give it the international stamp of approval. Go to the UN Security Council and say it's okay for Iran to have this dangerous capability. So that's the biggest lesson for me. Stick to our traditional principles. Reactors are fine, fuel-making capabilities are not.
Question? Over here. I think we're going to go here first, sir. You just wait until the microphone comes to you. And
I suppose this question, well, the name is Michael Strutzel. This will be for Dr. Kroenig. Please comment on what you think was the result of both India and Pakistan having acquired nuclear capabilities, and compare that to today, the example set by what happened in Libya for North Korea.
Well, a few thoughts, I guess. One, there is a difference between what India and Pakistan did, and I think the programs in Iran and North Korea, because India and Pakistan never signed the NPT. And they, they haven't had a war, but there have been many. I think there are a number of aspects to your question. So, just a few quick comments. So, I think there is a difference between that and a country that signs the NPT, gets the technology, and then cheats, as Iran and North Korea did. Two, there hasn't been a war yet. But these countries have only had nuclear weapons for a little over a decade. There have been a number of dangerous consequences. Pakistan has transferred nuclear technology to Iran, Libya, and North Korea. There have been several high-stakes crises. U.S. feared there could be a nuclear war in the Kargo crisis in 1999. And it's still fairly early days. Pakistan talks about using nuclear weapons early in a crisis as a way to offset an Indian conventional invasion. So I think there is a very credible pathway to war there. There could be a Pakistani cross-border incursion. India responds with a conventional invasion. Pakistan uses tactical nuclear weapons, and then we're into a nuclear exchange. So I think it's a very dangerous situation. But to get, I think, to what your question was getting at, I think there's no doubt that the supreme leader in Iran and Kim Jong-un in North Korea looked at what happened in Libya. Gaddafi had this WMD program. He decided to give it up. And a few years later, he was overthrown. And I think the lesson they took from that is that you don't give up your WMD programs. So I think that lesson of Libya will make any future Iran or North Korea nuclear negotiations harder.
Got time for one last brief question. Please, hear this lady right there.
Hi, Morgan. Your title is very interesting, actually. It says the new age, and we are in the 21st centuries. So cyber and space are becoming more and more players in whether defense or an offensive operation. How do you see the nuclear posture, regardless which country has nuclear in it, evolving or maybe declining while the space and cyber are getting more and more attention and interest from other non-nuclear countries?
Keith, do you mind taking that?
No, I'm happy to. You're absolutely right that space threats and cyber threats are playing a more prominent role now than they did even fairly recently, and are likely to play a more prominent role in the future. And so when we think about the relationship between those threats and nuclear policy and deterrence, per se, we have to understand that the threats of the Cold War have now expanded. In other words, it's not just a nuclear threat that we need to be concerned about. It's not just biological threats. It includes these really unprecedented threats. And so there are some very interesting questions with regard to, for example, deterring cyber threats. And I won't take but a minute. But one of the things that we presumed during the Cold War, by and large, was that if somebody decided to launch an attack, we would be able to identify who that somebody was. And so we could deter that somebody by having a deterrent threat in advance. So that if, and let's just use the Soviet Union, if the Soviet Union engaged in a highly provocative act, let's say a nuclear strike against us or our allies, we would know who that was, and our deterrent would prevent that in the first place. Why? Because we would know who it was, right? And we would know their address. And so our threats should be able to deal with that. Our deterrent threat should be able to deal with that problem. Fast forward to where we are now, and think about the cyber threats and what's called forensics. Do we have the forensics to know where the threat came from or where the attack came from? Now, I don't know if we can answer that question confidently yes or absolutely not here and now, but to the extent that there's uncertainty about where, let's say, a cyber attack came from, how do you try and get deterrents to operate? You can't just have a blanket statement that says if we receive a cyber attack, we're going to respond to X, Y, and Z. I mean, you can, but it's probably not a very credible deterrent threat. And so one of the questions that comes to the front right now as we look at cyber as cyber threats is something we will need to prevent and hopefully be able to deter is our ability, our forensics ability to identify where did that threat originate, where did that attack originate, so that we can have deterrence help to preclude the possibility. Otherwise, the responses are simply trying to protect against it, which is something we need to do anyway, so that we can deny the activity. So it's a whole new world for deterrence. And so even if you do have the forensics so that you can identify where the threat came from, what kind of response do you try and use as a deterrent? And what kind of response is credible? Is a nuclear threat credible with regard to a cyber attack that may not have initially destroyed anything initially? So these are great questions, and they're going to be the questions that we need to deal with regard to how to do deterrence for the next probably 40 years. It's a new area for even some of the most basic questions of how do you apply deterrence to the reality of the threats we face. Good question.
Thank you. And with that, will you please join me in thanking our panelists for a great discussion?